Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. You can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Today, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and our guest is not in Washington, D.C. He's out in L.A., Chris Fenton. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Emily.
Yeah, super excited to have a conversation with you about all things Hollywood and China this afternoon. Now, what is your formal title right now?
Well, right now I'm sort of in another part of my career. I am a CEO of a off-balance sheet financing slate mechanism for the studios, mainly because the studios do need financing to help make these very expensive, ever increasing more expensive movies. So that's one of the things that I've been working on. But I also have a book coming out in July called Feeding the Dragon, inside the $1 trillion dilemma facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American business. So I call myself an author, although I would imagine I'm probably not quite the level of writer that you are. And then I'm still producing things in the film and television space. And also people do tend to call upon me as a China expert, which sometimes I'm reluctant to admit I am, but there are some things that I do know a decent amount of in between the U.S. and China relationship.
Right, and that book is going to be really great. That comes out, what, July 28th?
Yeah, it comes out July 28th. We're actually trying to move it up a little bit just because election season is getting so heated and China becomes such a very strong topic, as you've seen. What's interesting is Post Hill Press and Simon & Schuster, long ago, we decided to print it here in the United States of America rather than in China. So we actually have the ability to possibly move it up, but there's a lot of competition from other books that we're planning on printing overseas that are trying to cut the line. So July 28th at the latest, possibly a few weeks earlier, but pre-orders are up. So appreciate any pre-order support that people want to give.
Yeah, absolutely. And Feeding the Dragon, I mean, that's the name of the book. It's a really good jumping off point for our conversation, because really the reason that you started writing this book, and I first started talking to Chris for a story that I wrote on Hollywood and China in the Federalist, and called on him and his experience and his expertise in the space for that story. But the book really is based on your extensive experiences distributing films in China. So can you talk to us a little bit about your background as a Hollywood executive, dealing with China, distributing films in China, and then why you decided to write Feeding the Dragon based on that? And I mean, when did you decide to write this book? Was it around the NBA protests? Was it a little bit earlier than that?
Well, I've always sort of, when I was in college, I actually attempted as an engineering grad to write something. And I wrote a manuscript that was unpublished, but it actually sold to Fox as a movie that never got made. So I've always been a little intrigued to dabble in the writing space. So over time in working between the US and China, which really started around the year 2000 and went obviously up until the present day, there were so many colorful things and crazy things and stories that I would tell on panels or in interviews or whatever. And people were like, God, you got to do the movie version of this or write a book or whatever. So it was always in my head, maybe at some point I would write it. But I really wanted to sit back and see it from a different perspective, possibly on the outside looking backwards, which is what I decided to do after I left the Chinese company I was working with. So what ended up happening was publishers had approached me about writing like an expert book on China, like, oh, what are the top 10 things to do as a business person in China to get things done or whatever it was. And to me, that wasn't really all that exciting. Additionally, I thought the story of what I was doing and sort of fell into, right? I have a practical applied expertise that just sort of happened, like Michael Keaton in the movie Gung Ho. I wasn't a China studies PhD. I wasn't a Bloviat think tank guy from the Beltway. I just sort of fell into it. And I thought I wanted to write something where anybody felt like they could have had that same experience and sort of had that fog of war story and adventure of really these two superpowers coming together in the world of capitalism at the very beginning, right? I mean, after Tiananmen Square, it sort of started the world of capitalism between the two countries. But the year 1999, 2000 was really when it started to get momentum.
And that's right
So
around when you started working in that space.
that was right when I got in there, and
Mm.
it was super interesting. I mean, even the first trip I made over to China, they used to say that the national bird was the crane, right? And they meant the construction crane, because the cranes were everywhere, and you could see the potential of that market and how much potential for US companies there was to make money there and to sell products and services. And obviously it was a huge, huge puzzle, an enigma. It was very mysterious how things actually operated there and how US companies could adapt and get into that market. So I jumped in there almost blindfolded, but wanting to learn it, as did everybody else. And then there was all kinds of baggage of companies and different people that had tried to do it in the very early days. So there was a lot of misunderstanding on how to actually get things done and whether you could get things done. And we just kept plugging along, and we would accomplish little baby steps all along the way. And then eventually they got to be bigger and bigger projects, and they became front page of paper type of accomplishments. And they also involved a lot of US government and China government oversight. So it just got bigger and bigger as time went on. So my feeling was, why don't I write a story about this sort of fish out of water guy that fell into this like anybody could have, and was just wrapped up in it in this crazy sort of adventure in a Michael Lewis type of way. And that's what I did. And then what's interesting is when I finished the book, which was right around, I brought a US congressional delegation to China in late August of last year, 2019. And the thought was I was going to finish the book and hand it in to Simon & Schuster and Post Hill Press with this prologue of me in Hong Kong. We had just met with some protesters and had lunch with Carrie Lam earlier that day. And you could smell the pepper spray. You knew the protests were nearby, and just sort of write this sort of thoughtful why I wrote this book. And I did that. And then I get back to the US and I do a couple, edits and changes, and I'm about to turn it in. And then Daryl Morey, the Houston Rockets GM, sends out that tweet. And of course I'm going, well, that's going to be a problem for the NBA in China. And my book is sort of going to explain like why that is and all that stuff. So it's perfectly timed. But then what I didn't expect, and it's totally surprised me, and it changed everything, was the wokeness, not to use that overused word, but what happened awoken the United States public to what was going on in this globalist agenda between the US and China, and the fact that companies and management and investors and even leadership of this country were really pandering to China for the sake of making money there. And I looked back at what I wrote and I go, oh my God, I'm to blame. Like in this thing, I'm one of the many people that was completely complicit in it. And quite frankly, I felt really badly about it. So I had to look at it again through a different lens. And I added a forward and a postscript to it that addressed some of the feelings, the mixed feelings I had after writing that and after spending essentially almost 2 decades in the middle of that. And now my mission today is a fewfold. One is I have 2 13-year-old kids. So my goal is really, in whatever small way I can be a part of it, to keep the superpowers from entering a Cold War, or worse, entering a war. And obviously there's various individuals who think we're already at war in various ways or in a Cold War already. But I look at a Cold War sort of in the same way the US-China relationship was post-Korean Peninsula War and pre-1971, which was really the ping pong diplomacy moment in Kissinger and Nixon. That was okay back then to be in a Cold War, which meant no communication, no trade, no exchange, nothing. Why? Because China was a sleeping giant then. But today, they're not. They're a dragon spreading their wings. And if we enter that same type of Cold War phase, it's only going to escalate and get worse and worse. And my argument to the people that say we are in a Cold War is I say, I don't think that's the case. In my opinion, you don't have massive amounts of trade relations. You're not negotiating trade relations. You're not having a lot of commerce and cultural exchange between two countries that are technically in a Cold War. That gets shut down. So right now, even though we seem to be on the verge of a Cold War, I don't think practically we are at one. So I'd like to keep us from getting there. And one of the messages I have, not to take over this podcast, is that there's five bars that keep us talking. We've talked about this before. There's five.
I was going to ask you just about this, because what's interesting about you is people might expect, based on all of the exposure or the revelations that you've brought to the forefront about Hollywood's relationship with China, and the criticisms, people would probably expect you to be a hardcore hawk. And in some ways you are, but you're also pro-diplomacy, and you want the relationship to be good, in a way that some of the, people that are like very hawkish on this issue don't. And your 5 points about diplomacy, they're very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, there's always been this argument, at least at the birth of globalist agenda, right, where eventually we'll win over China so that they are a lot more like us. Right. I think at this point of my experience, I don't think they're ever going to agree with us on human rights issues, politics, or national security issues. So I would like to say, let's agree to disagree. I mean, let's play the long game and see if we can win them over there, but let's not make that an initiative of ours. Instead, where there is a real potential to do something constructive, that's in the cultural and commercial exchange area. And that the op-ed that you helped me put together for the Federalist stated where I think both hawks and doves can live in that area, right? Commercial exchange is really important if we want to monetize that market, right? And I think there's a way where we can level the playing field, play really hardball with them, reset the trade relationship, yet also keep commercial exchange going there. And a lot of that commercial exchange involves cultural aspects of our industries here, right? I mean, you might not think of Nike as a cultural business, but it is. And every time a kid wears a pair of Nikes in China, he has a little bit of Western influence brought to him, because Nike has, whether you love Nike, the brand, or not, there's obviously differences of opinion there, but they carry this sort of renegade freedom of expression type of mantra, right? And that aspirational brand recognition for Chinese is brought to them when they wear those shoes. The same reason why it's nice for them to be able to go see a movie that they're super excited about that comes out of Hollywood. There's a lot of Western, parts of values and principles and different messaging in there that are just simply because it's part of the story. It's not like we're putting propaganda into those movies, but it does seep into that market, and it does help them understand some of the things that they might be missing that they have under CCP control. So there's a hawkish element to continuing to push commerce and culture into that country. But I will say, to add to that mission of staying away from a Cold War, I'm really trying to figure out the smartest way for us to reset this relationship while staying away from war. And it's an exciting challenge because it is so layered, but it's also nice too that, some of my applied practical experiences come in handy. Like I've been talking to one of the reps in Congress's new China task force. And I love the fact that they're reaching out to me about, different advice that I can give just from being part of that, machine that was doing stuff in between the two countries, right? Like it's an applied practical experience. So I'm glad that I can have a little bit of a voice in what they're going to be doing in regards to implementing policy and laws moving forward with this relationship.
Your experience on this in particular, sort of the soft power conversation, is one thing I wanted to get your opinion on. I mean, I think people, not everyone, I think a lot of people are increasingly skeptical of the argument that soft power is meaningfully warming the Chinese people to the West or to the United States. Maybe it worked in the Cold War in the Soviet Union, but we've been doing this for 2 decades and we're still where we are right now. In your experience, how does the influence of even just American films in the Chinese box office, of course some of them, and you've been very I think straightforward about the censorship that you've witnessed and that does happen in Hollywood. You had a great term, the preemptive censorship that happens in addition to anything else that goes on. But in your experience, how meaningful is the soft power of American films at the Chinese box office?
Well, it's significant. I mean, there's not, like I said, we're trying to make great stories in Hollywood that resonate with audiences around the world. China obviously is the second largest market and soon to be the first. So keeping China in mind in regards to how you monetize content is going to be a very big priority. And keep in mind, most Hollywood executives are thinking about how do we monetize China. They're not thinking, oh, how do we please China, right? But unfortunately, to monetize China, you have to get your product into China. And not just you have to get it supported by the government so that it's monetizable, right? Like, because there's a lot of content from Hollywood that gets into China simply through the black market. And it's watched by everybody, but there's no money coming back to the United States for it. So the goal is to be one of those forms of content that's monetizable. Now, how does it create a soft power dynamic? It's a slow seepage. It's the ability for them to see freedoms that they might not see in their daily course of life. It's aspirational. It's almost like a bit of a luxury brand type of phenomenon. It's like, well, why do they love Louis Vuitton and why do they love, German automobiles or whatever it is? It's because it represents something that has been around for a long time. It's from the Western world. It has a certain quality associated with it. And all of that just adds to the aspiration of why they want to come here and study here and visit here and maybe even live here one day. So it's an important aspect. Now, the censorship issue, I think, is really interesting to address because today, you and I saw that Ted Cruz dropped the bill on the Senate floor about prohibiting Hollywood from having access to federal assets in regards to making movies. His argument is, I don't like China censoring, for instance, he uses the Top Gun jacket. Maverick is wearing the Taiwanese flag, the Japanese flag. They blur it out or they took it off. I'm not exactly sure what they did in order to appease the CCP in hopes that they can get the movie released there and make a lot of money.
But they made that movie with the help of the American military. The Defense Department collaborated with Top Gun 2 and poured a bunch of military resources into it. And they do that partially as a PR as a PR campaign, as part of a PR campaign, but they also do it as training. They use Hollywood production as a way to train the military in, whether it's with aircraft or whether it's with ships, whatever it is. But Ted Cruz's bill is essentially saying, why are we using, and this is something we've talked about before, why are we using American resources to aid the CCP censorship of, the CCC's wrongful censorship of American-made films?
Well, and even more so, the Chinese were partially funding that movie. Tencent Pictures was one of the financiers. So the Chinese were involved in making a movie, which technically was the reboot of a movie that was one of the greatest marketing tools for, I think, the Navy or whatever back in its day. So
right.
There's a lot of irony in there. Where I think something where it needs to be differentiated, right, is there's a lot of countries that censor content from Hollywood. Hollywood tries to make, there's super high-end Italian restaurants in Washington, D.C. for a certain type of foodie, but it doesn't play everywhere, right? So Hollywood sort of tries to make the Olive Garden version of Italian food that everybody likes, right?
This is why I love movies.
Yeah, well, but it's they're trying to appeal to the largest audience. China's part of that, right? So they're going to preemptively censor things that they think might be insulting simply on a free market principle, right? Now, if you make a sports movie about, like Miracle, where, it's the US beating the Russians in hockey, well, that movie was probably made thinking it's not going to work in Russia, right? And if you made the same movie about the US beating the Chinese, that studio's going, okay, well, we're making that movie, but let's assume it's not going to work in China. No Chinese want to watch the US beat them or something.
Red Dawn. This happened with the Red Dawn remake.
Exactly. So Red Dawn was one of those, and I still wonder like why they ever made that movie that way. But the issue that I have is, Japan, South Korea, a lot of countries do have censorship within their borders, right? They don't like a certain, use of drugs, or there's nudity or whatever it is, and they'll cut that out. China should have that exact same right? Like in a perfect world, the Taiwanese flag or the Japanese flag could just stay on there, and you let free market principles decide whether consumers in China want to see the movie or not, or whether they're insulted, right? And quite frankly, some of them might be insulted from it anyway, so free market principles would take over with that patch on the jacket. But the censorship that I think I'm okay with, if we're looking for a compromise that allows us to get even more access to the market, is allowing them to censor the movie by taking the patch off or blurring off those jackets inside of their borders, right? What I don't agree with, and we have to stop, is this ability for them to tell us it can't be shown with those patches on anywhere else in the world, right? And of course we have that right, but they're saying, well, we're not going to show it in our market if you do that. That is wrong. That is using their leverage as a market to tell us what we can and can't do around the world. And I think that is completely something we need to reset the table on. It's not something the United States does. It's not something any other country does. So we need to fix that. And even worse is in the situation of Red Dawn, they said, if you keep that movie the way it is, with the Chinese losing to the Wolverines or whatever, you're never going to release it in our market. And if you release it anywhere else around the world, we're going to blackball your studio so you can never get anything else into this country. So the studios rushed to fix that movie. They released it around the world with, I think, North Korea as the enemy. And China still penalized them for, I don't know, probably close to a year, where those studios couldn't get stuff into the market. So that type of cross-border censorship, which, by the way, goes back to the Daryl Morey thing we talked about.
Right.
Daryl Morey the NBA should still be allowed to have access to that market, right? But that Daryl Morey tweet should be censored from the market, right? In the way I'm talking about. Like, it's fine. Daryl Morey said something. They don't want anybody seeing it. They have their firewall. They're going to prevent people in that market from seeing it, okay? Some people in the market will hear about it, and the NBA still plays the games, and some of them might boycott watching the NBA games. That's fine. That's the problem, freedom of the press. If you're the owner of Chick-fil-A and you say something that's, against a certain minority or whatever, that minority might not go to Chick-fil-A. And that's part of the beauty of freedom of the press, is or the freedom of speech. You have the ability to say what you want to say, but there might be penalties for it in some way in the free market. Morey should have been, able to say what he said. I can see where they would say, hey, if you're in our territory, you can't say that. But outside, okay, great. But just know that your tweet is not going to be seen inside of our country.
You brought up two things there that got into my next question for you, which is one, the point that you made about Red Dawn. When we look at that case study, that studio caved ultimately, and that's really what we see very often. And Ted Cruz brought up the example of Bohemian Rhapsody on the Senate floor when he introduced legislation on Thursday, which was really interesting because that movie censored Freddie Mercury's homosexuality to show the film in China. So what's interesting is how the film industry, Hollywood, which is obviously, overwhelmingly pro-LGBT. They now have to balance the sort of financial concerns with this idea that they might be complicit in allowing China to undermine their social values. And I think this is where the issue gets frustrating for a lot of conservatives, because you bring in the idea of Hollywood's hypocrisy. And I'm sure a lot of actors have looked at what happened to Richard Gere after he came out in favor of Tibet. But it does kind of get to this question of, how do you still make money and export American soft power while also upholding your social cultural values in a country where they are not at all agreed upon? And then, has there been hypocrisy in really the last 2 decades on this issue in Hollywood?
Well, look, you're essentially peeling the onion that's showing all the different layers of the issue here, right? And that's why it's a difficult subject to bring to light. I actually feel pretty privileged right now because I still have business in Hollywood, but I'm able to sort of back away from it and be a voice of, let's keep this, like, it's been kept a third rail issue for so long, right? It's Daryl Morey has brought it into light, whether he wanted to or not. It's out there. Like, why can't we talk about it as a nation, right? Because if we're just blaming industries or just blaming individuals like LeBron James, like, what do you think about Hong Kong? Or we're just blaming individual companies, we're not going to be able to take a stand that's uniform across the way we want to preserve American values and principles and what's important to our national interests, right? This has got to be something that we come together with as leaders, as business leaders, as citizens, as people that are conflicted, right? I'm conflicted. I have lots of business between US and China. And quite frankly, there are times where I'm wondering, wow, did I step into stuff where I'm not going to be allowed back into China? And I'm sort of that mindset, hey, I'm going to be the one that's sort of a squeaky wheel talking about this. And on the backside of this, it's going to make everything better. So if they say I can't come in the country for a couple years, well, guess what? I bet you if we do this right, on the backside, we're going to have a much better foundation of a relationship between the two countries, because we sort of aired out our differences as if a married couple goes to a counselor and just vents, right? We have to discuss things here as a nation, decide how we're going to create a path forward for every company, what's tolerable to us as people of the United States, what's tolerable to the way we expect business to be done, what we think is pushing the envelope in accessing that market, yet also not going beyond what we feel is true as Americans. But it's going to take real discussion, and it's going to take time once we decide what we're going to do to battle China and get what we want out of it. And it's one of these op-eds I'm working on right now, which is, how do we stomach a real reset between the US and China? Because I feel like every time we try to take a stand, we pay attention to the stock markets. And when the stock markets fall, we suddenly go, oh, wait, we didn't mean that, but here's how we're going to do it. But the fact is, this is a real reset. And if we're going to bring back supply chains, if we're going to bring back national security interests that are produced overseas, if we're going to take a stand on censorship issues like you're talking about, if we're really going to focus on things like their forced joint ventures that they make every company do. I mean, for instance, how about the fact that Disney opens up their theme park? We're all celebrating about that there in Shanghai, but no one's talking about the fact that the Chinese government owns 57% of that entity, right? 57 cents of every dollar goes to the Chinese government, not to Disney. So there are things that need to get rebalanced, and it's going to be a hard, drawn out battle to get there. We're going to need to use all the leverage that we can create to reset this playing field, but it has to get done. It has to.
And that, by the way, is partially why the Chinese government is able to exercise so much control over film production, right? Is because a lot of those companies, the Chinese government has heavy stakes in to begin with. And then you go through a censorship process, whether or not the Chinese government has stake in your production company, you go through a censorship process, submitting your scripts and your film to the government anyway. But a lot of those companies, actually, the Chinese government literally has financial stakes in.
Yeah, well, there's straight imports, right, which are made by the studios, and then they're shown to China Film Group, and China Film Group then will talk to the Film Bureau and maybe all the way up the ladder to the Politburo or to the Ministry of Propaganda to try to figure out whether that movie is appropriate for their audience and whether they're going to allow the studio to monetize it. And then there's a certain amount of quota that is given to Hollywood movies or international movies that give access to, I think, roughly 35 movies a year. So there's that import part. And then there's the collaborations that are done between US and China entities that circumvent some of that scrutiny because they're seen as partially Chinese, right?
Tencent, Alibaba.
Yeah, exactly. And then there were actually things called co-productions, which I think were so difficult to actually make that people really haven't been working on those. But the kinds you're talking about where there's actual Chinese investment, there's Chinese, maybe even production companies involved, et cetera, those have a little extra wind to their back for the government to say, oh, we'll allow that in, because they see it as something that the collaborative effect had on their market was good for their people. So that by letting it in, letting it monetize is a message to the rest of Hollywood. Hey, you guys should do this more often because look at how well that last movie did that did the same thing. When we did Iron Man 3, that was similar. When we did Looper, that was similar. We did other movies that weren't as big at box office, but they still worked, like the Point Break reboot, et cetera, where that China-US collaborative effect did give us access to the market in a better way.
One thing I think might be underappreciated among American hawks is that we do have some leverage on the Chinese Communist Party, and that the Chinese people legitimately love the NBA and they love American films. Can you talk a little bit about the balance that the CCP faces and how that might give the United States government leverage in any ongoing negotiations that take place in this space?
Well, one of the things that makes it difficult is the fact that a lot of stuff that we think isn't getting access to the market but it's not getting monetized in the market. We talked about the black market, pirated DVD stuff, et cetera. The CCP has been very good at turning a blind eye to that stuff, knowing that their people want to see it. But the CCP doesn't want whoever's involved on the other side of it to monetize it for whatever reason. Maybe it's one extra movie over the quota, or maybe it had stuff that they didn't like in it, or maybe it's a studio they don't, have a good relationship with, whatever it is. The NBA situation is interesting because there is massive, massive interest in the game of basketball, going back to when Mao first sort of started running the modern day China in 1949. He made basketball and ping pong the two quasi-national sports. So basketball is in the cultural fabric of that country. What they did do is they utilized the process and a lot of the expertise of the NBA to create the CBA, which is the Chinese version of the NBA. So there is professional basketball in that market to satisfy a lot of the demand of that consumer. That said, the world's biggest superstars in the sport are in the NBA. And the CCP knows that the people of that country want to see NBA product on television. So it is a little bit of oh boy, well, we need to teach a lesson to the NBA, make sure they never do it again. So let's penalize them. But then there's the offset of the CCP is always trying to make sure they're giving just enough to their people, 1.4 billion people, so that there's not another Tiananmen Square incident. So, little things like not letting them see the NBA, to allowing somebody to protest, to allowing them to see, a Red Dawn type of movie, to other things that seep into the populace there, could create discontent towards the CCP and eventually lead to some sort of revolution. So they're always thinking about that. The NBA, whether it has the leverage to utilize that and say, hey, look, your country really wants to see our stuff, enough's enough, let us in there. I don't know. There's people that are making that argument. But remember, the CCP is really good at turning on the propaganda machine. If somehow they want to turn people against the NBA or to deflect attention from the NBA to something new, they're really good at it. And I got into a conversation about this with actually Steve Bannon's producer, and in regards to the power of the Ministry of Propaganda. And I said, imagine if the Fox News stations, the Glenn Becks, the Pragers, the Ben Shapiros, the Steve Bannons, everybody, and CNN and MSNBC and Bill Maher and Rachel Maddow and everybody on this side, imagine if they all had the same message and they were all pushing that message at all times. Imagine how much effect that would have on 90% of the population in the United States believing in one sort of thematic or one narrative, right? Right now in this country, we sort of have a right and a left point of view, so it bifurcates everything. In China, they essentially have that version of narrative, and it's completely uniform and completely on the same page, and it's completely pounded away day after day after day. So if they want to turn everybody against the NBA somehow, they can do it. In fact, right now we're seeing consumer sentiment towards anything from the United States, product or service, is really negative right now because there's a nationalist push in China that's battling the same sort of negative rhetoric that's coming over here in the United States towards China, right? We're seeing, I think the latest Pew survey was 66% of Americans see China in a skeptical way, and some large percentage sees them as an enemy. Well, in China, it's the same thing towards the United States. And if the Ministry of Propaganda really wants to increase that percentage, they can push that narrative. So it's really strong. So that leverage point of saying, well, they really want the NBA and we have leverage, I'm highly doubtful that's the case.
One question I want to ask, and some of our conservative listeners and viewers right now might recognize Chris from recent appearances on Tucker Carlson's show, on Maria Bartiromo's show, on Adam Carolla's podcast, and you have a long history with Adam Carolla. But I want to ask what your experience has been like since you stepped into this conversation. You're really trying to talk to both sides of the issue, and not only just talk to them, but bring them together and forge kind of a coalition between the left and the right on this. You're at the forefront of that effort. Talk to me a little bit about what that's been like and the reception that you've gotten maybe in Hollywood and with people, sort of your industry peers, as you've undertaken this effort.
Wow, that's a fantastic question, actually. I'm trying to stay super apolitical, and I try to even avoid where my political affiliations are. But when people ask me, I sort of go back to the John Huntsman version of political affiliation, which is country first. I tend to vote whoever I think is best for the country. I don't really look at what party they're in. And China's an interesting challenge for the United States, because I think if we're going to actually solve the challenge and reset it in a way that's best for Americans, it has to be across the aisle agreement on how to approach it. So how friends of mine or peers in Hollywood look at my appearances on a lot of the stuff that's considered on the right side of the aisle, I think I do get a lot of flack for it, but I also think I get a lot of respect for it. And when I talk to them and fill them in on some of the conversations that I have off camera with a lot of these hosts or personalities or whatever, I feel like I'm able to portray the fact that, you know, there's a lot of things in common that we have. We're all American. I mean, and yes, we don't see eye to eye on every issue, but I bet you see eye to eye on a majority of the issues. You just don't put in the effort to figure it out. And I actually go back to how we met. We met through Phil Wegman over at Real Clear Politics, excuse me. And I met him at the Freedom Conference that the Steamboat Institute does, because they had me come up there for a movie I produced called Chappaquiddick. And Chappaquiddick was the story, obviously, that embroiled Ted Kennedy in a big scandal back in the 60s. And their initial thought was that it was a lot of hard right-wing, you know, producers and filmmakers that were involved in that movie. And I said, well, what's interesting is that almost everybody that was involved with that movie was very center or Democrat, right? Mm-hmm. But we all collectively thought that there was this fog of war that was created, and all this cover up and all this real factual truth that made a very interesting, compelling story that we should bring to light about the Kennedys that a lot of us revered, almost thought of them as superheroes. And we tried to tell a very balanced version of the story. So I said to the Steamboat Institute, if you want me to come up and talk about that, I will. But if you want me to come up and just bash the Kennedys or whatever, I'm not interested in that. And they said, oh my God, we would love to have a voice like that up here. You know, it's very smart. And I went up, and it was the best experience. And I met Phil there, and then met you. And then I've had a blast talking on both sides of the aisle, but it's mainly been on the right. And the reason why that is that China has been a focus of the right in a much stronger way than on the left. And I'm sort of shocked by that. I'm gonna call it a little hypocritical, because if you think of what China represents that the Democrats should be against, number one is, well, offshoring of jobs. I mean, the Democrats have been a big proponent of labor and the middle class and protecting those jobs. And China has been a conduit to causing a strong decrease in those type of jobs. They've also been big into human rights, the Democrats have. Obviously, China hasn't been great in that area. Freedom of speech is another one for the Democrats. China actually has issues in that space. So there's a lot of areas where I'm surprised the Democrats haven't jumped into it, but I do think they're going to as election season progresses, because election season is going to pull both Biden into it and all the down ticket people that are running from the Democratic side in regards to how tough they can be on China, et cetera. And that will be a good point where I think, even though there's going to be election carnage and, you know, partisan politics, there's also going to be a common, and I'm not going to call China an enemy, I'm going to call them a strategic competitor, but there'll be a common strategic competitor or an enemy, if you want to call them an enemy, where it can bring us together. And I'm hoping that that challenge allows us as a nation to at least come together on something that's super important for generations to come, and we figure out how to fix this together. So I'm going to continue on the apolitical path, and I'm going to continue telling everybody on both sides of the aisle that they need to keep talking to each other, quite frankly. This is too big an issue to bifurcate partisan line.
Chappaquiddick, by the way, is a technically excellent and fairly balanced film, like you mentioned. Just wanted to put that in there. And I remember reporting on it at the time and hearing from people involved in the production about the sort of panic among some people in Hollywood over accepting the script or delving into the production of the film. That's kind of an aside. But one thing is, you know, a lot of the people with these conflicting business interests that, might make them friendlier towards China or more likely to turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses, the free speech abuses, whatever it is. They tend to be centrists of the political establishment. And people who might be considered far right are having this conversation. Are you talking to people on the far left? Do you think the likeliest coalition is from the far right and the far left? Or have you also gotten a positive response from people in the center as well?
Well, I think I think China represents a real opportunity to bring definitely left and right together for a common cause, the same way the 2008 economic turmoil did. Because I look at the way the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movements occurred from 2008 financial crisis, and they both had essentially the same gripes and the same things that they wanted fixed. But what happened was one got commandeered by the left and one by the right. But if you look at sort of the grievances that they have on the far right and the far left, you could argue, and this is going to take us on a tangent, and I don't know if we want to go there, but there's a lot of parts of, say the Bernie Sanders stand and the Donald Trump stand on things where there's an agreement that the system doesn't work for 90% of the people of the United States of America, and it needs to be completely reset, or as like Steve Bannon calls it, the fourth turning. I sort of agree with that, and I think China is part of that equation, and I think China represents a real opportunity for the 90% of the people of this country to come together on a collective idea and movement. And I hope as that happens that they don't get commandeered by political interests that are trying to tear apart what's already a unified movement. And maybe that's rainbow and unicorn, and I get that, but people on the left and the right are very similar. They just are. There's certain things that they're never going to agree on together, but there's so many other things they can. And I just hope that something like China, which isn't going away, we don't want a Cold War with them. We don't want to be at war with them. We want a relative peace, but a competitive situation where we're strategic about it and we're protecting values and interests, but we're also utilizing a market that can make us very prosperous here in this country, especially once we bring back some of the most important supply chain issues and repatriate a lot of things. There's still a lot of money to send the opposite direction, product and services that we then get money and bring back to the United States because we're penetrating that market. That money comes back, creates jobs, grows GDP, and like we talked about earlier, spreads soft power influence into a country that over time could become more like us. Hard to tell right now if that's going to happen. I doubt it's going to happen anytime soon, but they play the long game. Why shouldn't we?
Right. That's super interesting. And while we have you here, you have a lot of expertise on one of the most devastated sections of the economy, due to the coronavirus pandemic, which is Hollywood. And I wanted to quickly get your thoughts on how this will reshape Hollywood, how it's already reshaping Hollywood. Something really interesting that leaked recently was Tyler Perry's plans for changing or tweaking production on his lot down in Atlanta. He called it Camp Quarantine in this long document about how, the steps that you're going to have to take when he reopens in July and starts production on some of his films. Just really, really extensive steps, involving constant hand washing and changes to craft service and all of that stuff. When do you think production's going to restart? How is it going to be done? I think Blumhouse is starting production on some sort of lower budget horror movies. But just, this is a huge loaded question, but just generally broadly, how do you think Hollywood is being reshaped? And if I could also get your thoughts on what's going to happen to the theater chains, that would be great as well.
Yeah, so it's two sides of it. Like how's Hollywood looking at the consumer moving forward, right? So
yeah.
You bring up the theater chains. I think you're going to see obviously a reluctance, the going to movie theaters here in this country was already sort of a fragile habit. I think you're going to see people still continue to go to movies that are massive tent poles, fun to be around other people with, to watch together, big,
like an
loud
Iron Man 3.
Like an Iron Man 3 or Transformers or whatever it is. So those will still be released wide in theaters here domestically and obviously around the world. I think you'll also have great sort of water cooler community experience movies like a Get Out or a Paranormal Activity, or the great, rated R Seth Rogen movie that people want to laugh being surrounded by a bunch of other people laughing. So those will still work in theaters, but I think you're going to see a lot of movies that typically would get theatrical releases in the United States suddenly go straight to the premium pay-per-view model, which we've been witnessing, currently during this COVID crisis. I think that's going to continue with what they call the tweener movies, or, the movies that probably play just as well on your 4K screen in your apartment or at your home than they do at the theater. That said, there are developing markets like China or India or some in Latin America where the theater going experience is still super exciting. So we'll probably see maybe a movie that's not released theatrically here in the United States released theatrically in those other markets. And then you'll just see different distribution windows downstream, maybe lengthened in some markets where premium pay-per-view works better before going to SVOD or AVOD. And, in other markets, maybe it goes to SVOD or whatever their premium cable is right away. So there's going to be a lot of flexibility in that. On the production side, so that's the consumer side. On the production side, that's a real interesting question, because I don't know if anybody really understands the answer just yet. There's a lot of Gavin Newsom yesterday announced, or maybe 2 days ago, he announced that we can go back to producing movies, I think June 1 or something, but everybody was like, wait, what? Well, we're not ready. There's union issues, right? There's legacy union stipulations for big movies on how many people are involved and how big the crew is and the gaffers and the grips and all that stuff. That's got to get worked out. There's obviously union issues with actors and how long they're supposed to be technically working versus on break. So, quarantining them in a place that restricts what they can do might be considered work rather than off time. There's going to be a real issue with daily roles, right? Which is that's a sort of a staple of how a lot of real journey people, actors make a living. They do one day on this movie and they go do one day on that TV show, et cetera. That's going to be hard to keep quarantined and keep safe. So those type of roles might disappear. Extras, which by the way is another way people actually make a living out here. Those might be replaced completely by computer-aided imagery. We might see a lot of on-location stuff, which has always been the bread and butter for certain parts of the state here, or certain cities or certain countries around the world. We might see a lot of that stuff done through CGI technology. And then we also are going to have, it's always been amazing to me, but for a long time, Hollywood has always thought, well, if we want a leading man, it's got to be somebody from Australia or somebody from England, because they have great accents and they have a certain je ne sais quoi, and they make great movie stars. Well, visas might be very difficult. It might be tough for people to come in and come out of countries to go shoot. A lot of the stuff that we go and shoot in other countries because we save money there, which, by the way, goes into that repatriating manufacturing argument. That might get shut down. And then even the content itself might change, right? Like if we have modern day stories, are we going to actually implement modern day COVID types of plot points into the stories? Or are we going to go back to, if you're at a restaurant setting in a movie that takes place today, is it going to be the restaurant we saw 2 years ago setting, or is it going to be the new one with the plexiglass and the 6 feet apart? So it's really interesting. And then on top of it, you have the bonding issue, right? The insurance issues that are involved, which by the way is the same thing with all businesses. Like, what are the liabilities? Who's insuring what? Productions are extremely difficult to insure, because if one person that's key gets sick or injured or whatever, you could shut down the production for a certain amount of days. And some of these movies cost upwards of $1 million a day in production. So if you have somebody get sick and they got to shut down and test everybody, like, who's going to pay for that? So it's a long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer, and nobody does yet, but it is taking shape in real time out here, and we're trying to figure it out. And as you saw from Tyler Perry, who really runs production like a machine, he's trying to figure out how to get it back quickly, and he happens to be in a state that's very open right now, so he's trying to take advantage of that. And also they're fighting to keep business down there, so the quicker they get back, the more apt people are going to be to keep productions going on in Georgia, which is a big part of their economy.
Oh yeah. Have you seen 90 Day Fiancé's quarantine episodes, by the way?
I haven't, no.
Oh my gosh, they're fascinating. They have them, I mean, they basically just sent the cast ring lights, and they're filming themselves in their houses. Some of them have 2 cameras, clearly. It's very interesting. And so I think obviously in the short term, we're going to see an animation boom and reality TV boom. But given all of that, what is, like, just generally, what's the mood in Hollywood right now?
Well, I think the mood is similar to anywhere. I mean, you and I were talking off camera, and I think people are just really curious, like, where to get their news, what exactly is happening, what's the best route forward, what the future holds. People are thinking about their families and what the next few years is going to be, and income and all that stuff. So I think Hollywood's going through that same type of mentality and sort of same processing that everybody is. And on top of it, we're also trying to figure out, one of the nice things about Hollywood, and I know it gets a lot of flack too for various reasons, but Hollywood is the entertainment business. And if there's ever a time where people need to be entertained, it's now. So I'd like to believe collectively the media entertainment business feels like they have a service to bring great entertainment to people during trying times. So yes, there's money to make from it, but there's also a reason we all got into this. There is actually much easier ways to make a lot of money out there than making movies and TV, especially with how much disruption's going on in the space. So a lot of us are in it because we love popular culture and we love entertainment, like you. I mean, I'm curious, what's Tom gonna look like, or Sir, post-COVID? Like, I want to see what those camera crews are doing. I mean, what is Jax doing right now? I mean, come on, show us reality TV. What's happening?
Right. Well, I think Jack started a cocktail line with Lance Bass. And Chris is talking about Vanderpump Rules, by the way, which he watches, which I watch, which we, of course, cover as closely as I possibly can at the Federalist. But they filmed the reunion virtually, which they released a preview, and it looks really good.
Oh, really? Well,
yeah, Zoom reunion.
I'm excited to check it out. And when you come out here, I'll definitely set you up with my friend who represents all of them, so you can do a more in-depth column. Because what I love about the Federalist is there's some really deep, serious stuff, and you and I have been involved with a couple of those articles. But then you can go there and see Emily write this great column on Vanderpump Rules and how the finale really wasn't as good as it could have been. So that makes me laugh. And we'll see how reality television comes back from this, but it should be pretty interesting.
Yeah, there's just so much to think about. And before I let you go, my last question, just to tie it all together, how does the pandemic change China's relationship with Hollywood? Because sort of before this was happening with the NBA protests and everything, there was almost this like a little bit of dissent bubbling to the top, Judd Apatow criticizing, China in an interview with the New Yorker. But now the financial incentives, once that Chinese box office reopens and Hollywood is hurting, that's going to be a lot of financial incentive to recover by looking to the Chinese market. So am I correct to think that the effect would be to, Hollywood to kind of ratchet down the criticism that maybe was creeping up right before?
Yeah, I don't bring it. I mean, when I'm talking to members of Congress or, talking sort of macro about the reset of the US-China relationship, I don't really bring up micro industries like Hollywood itself. But one of the things, if you want an example of the reset that needs to be done, is when we actually get the approval to release a movie in China, the movie's released, and in some cases, like the last Avengers movie made $640 million just in that market, gross.
Mm.
But the amount of money that Disney Marvel gets from that is 25% of that. That's it, right? A 25% cut. The rest of the world is roughly, and there's a bunch of different formulas in different markets, but it's roughly 45 to 50% of the cut. So China is half of what the rest of the world gives back to Hollywood for that content. So that's one of the things that needs adjustment just on a micro level is, come on, guys, like, let's get up to speed with the rest of the world. This is ridiculous that you're being that unfair with it. So I think if anything, the COVID crisis has brought to light the sentiment here in the United States that, Donald Trump had been out there blasting the horn that the relationship needed to be reset. But there didn't seem to be enough groundswell of people in the United States to back them through thick and thin to make sure it happens, right? And part of that is our fixation on stock markets. Like anytime he would say something really hardcore and this is what we're going to do, the stock markets would drop. And then the people that weren't really behind the effort would, chirp in his ear and say, no, you can't do this. And then we rein it back. Now I think is the time where people are there strong enough. I compare it almost to like a World War II mentality, which is who cares about stocks? Like, let's reset the market. In World War II, it was a war we got dragged into. It was like, we don't care about what happens to the stock market. Let's rally together as a nation and let's work with our allies and let's win this war, right? In this situation, we need a reset. We need to reboot. It's going to be it's going to be a battle and a drawn out fight, but we need to get it done. So let's stop looking at things that are taking us off that, that ability of having resolve and determination to see it through, and let's fight through it. And so it's a long-winded way of saying, once again, the COVID situation, I think, is a uniter. And it's going to work for Hollywood getting a reset. It's going to help for pharmaceuticals. It's going to help for GM and the automotive business. It's going to help for Boeing and the microchip makers and everybody else. Like, it's a unifier. So I'm hoping the country sees it at that, doesn't polarize it, and gets together and let's fix it. Because on the backside, we're going to end up having a better relationship with China in the long run. And it's going to be better for Americans in the long run.
Chris, where can people follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because I'm very new to it, but I love having discussions on it. So at the Dragon Feeder is my handle. I'd love anybody that wants to come on and follow. I'm posting interesting articles there, and I love getting into debates. The Federalist has fantastic, smart readers and a great audience. That last op-ed, I think I responded to every comment on there. I won some readers in your audience over. Others, we agreed to disagree, but I'm good with that. I just like the fact that people are engaged in talking about this. And there's all kinds of other info on my website, which is feedingthedragonbook.com.
And people can pre-order on the website, right?
Yeah, they can pre-order on the website, and I appreciate all the pre-orders you can get because that just moves me to the front of the line on printing, and maybe we can move this thing up a little quicker.
July 28th, the book comes out?
July 28th, and hopefully we do a couple more columns together and maybe a comeback on your show sometime around then, because you're so much fun to talk to, and I love the audience and I love your platform.
Likewise, we will absolutely make sure to do that. Thank you, Chris, so much for stopping by. This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. He's Chris Fenton. Until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.